I'm Gene Kuleta from the Inter-American Dialogue, editor of the Latin America Advisor newsletters at the Dialogue, and today we're talking to Donna Hrinak. She's currently the president of Boeing Brazil. Thanks so much for joining us, Ambassador Hrinak.
Glad to be here, Gene.
And we're talking a lot, of course, we're thinking in 30-year increments since it's the Dialogue's 30th anniversary this year, and there have been so many monumental changes between 1982 and 2012, where we are today. And just a huge flood of things that have happened in the region with regard to the United States' influence and relations with Latin America. When historians look back at this 30-year stretch of time that the Dialogue has existed, what do you think will be the things that really rise to the top that will really be seen as the most monumental, interesting, important changes in the region?
Well, I've been working in the region even longer than the Dialogue. I started out in Mexico in the mid-'70s, and I think if you look back at that time, up until now, just the tremendous consolidation of democracy, and then more recently, the taking root of the macroeconomic reforms that have really made a difference in the life of the average person. When you look through the history of military governments, of repression, of human rights violations, and are things perfect now? No, of course they're not. But except for one country, all ruled by democratically elected governments, people feel that their judicial systems are more likely to deliver decisions that are based on the law. I think people just have a better sense of confidence that democracy is working for them. And obviously the economic progress is part of that. They've got a real stake in those democracies now.
And with such a spread of democracy that has happened throughout the region, there's one notable exception, and a couple more possibly by others' standards. But to take a look at what the region looked like in 1982 with civil wars going on in Central America and dictatorships, and now things relatively calm by those standards, and as you mentioned, with a lot of progress. What are the things that really led to all of that progress? Have there been any certain elements that came through in a lot of these countries, or how do you think all of this happened and how all of this changed in the last 3 decades?
Well, obviously the exogenous factors changed. When the Soviet Union fell, the civil wars in Central America no longer had that kind of an outside participation. They weren't being played out on the global scene any longer, and I think that helped Latin America to look at Latin America's problems. And Latin America and the Caribbean, and this is something I always try to say with the Dialogue, and I've been guilty myself of talking only about Latin America, but it's really Latin America and the Caribbean also. And I don't think we can, even though they've been democratic societies and had democratic governments perhaps a lot longer than some of the Hispanic Luso states of the region, to remember how much progress has been made in the small island states with English, Anglo-Saxon heritage, I think is important too. But that aside, I think if you, once we were able to focus on the hemisphere and see what really needed to be done here and didn't have to play that out against a Cold War, I think that was a major factor. Also the quality of leadership in Latin America. I mean, we've just had some amazing leaders, and we were able to talk about, Fernando Henrique Cardoso this year, and maybe living in Brazil now, I really feel that the rest of the hemisphere just owes a tremendous debt to Fernando Henrique and the kind of leadership he brought. So I think it's been a combination of factors. You can't cite any one, but being able to focus on what Latin America need to do. There's even a book out now saying when Latin America stopped listening to the United States and started doing the right thing, something like that. And I think not stopped listening to the United States, but stopped defining itself only in terms of the United States and what the U.S. was doing in the world.
Right, and since you mentioned that, of course, the U.S. is the hegemon in the region, has got such a overshadowing presence over much of the world, and it has, although by some accounts that presence or that influence may be diminishing in some ways. How do you see the U.S. influence in some of those countries that you mentioned, in the region in general, now as opposed to back in 1982?
Well, I think it varies greatly by country in the region, and I don't think any of the countries is vastly different from what it was like in 1982, maybe more so of what it was. I always think that Brazil defined itself vis-a-vis the United States in ways certainly different from how the countries of Central America did. So I think if Brazil is showing more independence, more in a position to assume its own role on the global scene, that was always Brazil's aspiration. It was always in that place, but perhaps didn't have the domestic base that allowed it to express itself globally in that way. United States influence, at least in politics and economics, has changed, has diminished. I don't think U.S. culture has diminished at all. I have to say, for good or ill, I think U.S. popular culture is as influential as ever in the hemisphere. But in general, I think that it's a good thing. I think countries have more confidence now. They're able to make their decisions based more objectively on what is good for our country, rather than how will this be seen by the United States and how will this affect our interests with the U.S. as the first consideration. It comes up later, I think, as they define policies, but it's not number one on the list.
Mm-hmm. So U.S. influence, you think, is diminishing. I mean, and especially you look at what just happened during the OAS General Assembly in Cochabamba a few days ago, and of course from a lot of the leftist governments like Ecuador and Venezuela and Bolivia. They're wanting to pull away from some of the OAS institutions because, as you know, the argument is that the OAS is too much influenced by the United States, and they want to distance themselves from things like that. How do you see that with regard to institutions perhaps pulling away from the U.S., pulling away from the OAS, some of these other institutions, and how might that sort of affect the dynamics?
Well, I think we're at a critical moment when we talk about regional institutions and what their relevance is going to be going forward. And I think, as the dialogue is looking more and more at what's happening within the United States too, and we were talking about this morning, Latin immigration into the United States, how that's changing our society. Will Latins care about whether there are multi-regional, where there's multilateral institutions within the region that tie the U.S. to their home countries, these countries of origin that remain, when I think of my grandparents coming over as children from Eastern Europe and never going back to their home countries, let alone FaceTiming or Skyping or emailing back to their families or sending money back to their families. So these ties are obviously much stronger. They're maintained through generations. Do these people care about whether the hemisphere then reflects on a macro level what's happening on their micro level, that we maintain these ties, we work together on these kinds of issues that we all share? And that's another thing that I think has happened recently, that just the sense of how much the issues of Latin America are the issues of the United States. We used to talk about that in the Sum of the Americas in 1994. I think maybe we were ahead of our time a little bit. People said that, but they really didn't internalize the fact that issues of infrastructure or education or healthcare or aging populations didn't understand that, yes, we in the U.S. had something to learn maybe from other countries in the hemisphere that were wrestling with the same issues.
Sure, and also with regard to immigration, this has caused such a big impact right here in the United States and in U.S. politics. There a lot of countries in the region, a few big ones that are having elections this year, and we are having an election this year. How do you see Latinos, folks from the Caribbean, and other immigrants from the region influencing the United States and U.S. politics and the U.S. election this year?
Well, every election, pundits talk about how this is going to be the election where the Latin vote makes a difference. And of course, the Latin vote has always been very divided. Immigration may be the issue on which the Latin vote really is galvanized this year. And we were hearing this morning that how many Latins say that even though they agree with a candidate on economic issues, which are generally considered to be their number one priorities, they would not vote for a candidate if they disagreed with him or her on immigration. So I think you may see the Latin vote really acting more as a bloc this year around the immigration issue, and maybe we'll get finally some unity between the Cubans in Miami and the Mexicans in Los Angeles, the Puerto Ricans up in Chicago, maybe all seeing that this is an issue in which they have real interest.
That's a good point. And I want to mention a little bit more about your history, being an integral part of PepsiCo's operations in the region, now with Boeing in Brazil. What about trade and commercial relations with Brazil, where you are now, and with the region sort of in general?
Yeah. This is one area where the governments have really fallen behind where the private sector is. And again, if you go back to '94, when we had great hopes that there would be a free trade area of the Americas, governments were very engaged in negotiating this, the framework in which this free trade would take place. The private sector has taken the lead over the years as those negotiations had fallen victim to, in part lack of progress in the Doha round and then other things happening in the hemisphere. So I think trade is very vibrant. Private sector ties are not only deepening, but transforming. I think as you see Brazilian companies or the famous multi-Latinas investing in the United States, which changes the private sector thinking in the hemisphere about what companies need to be able to prosper. And then they put pressure on their own governments, lobby, if you will, their own governments to make those changes at home too. So I think we're increasing the amount of trade. We could still, though, use, I think, that kind of more of a free trade mentality on the part of our governments to promote medium and small business engagement in this trade. Big companies, Boeing is always going to do well internationally. But how do you get a smaller, medium-sized company comfortable with trade without that legal framework? It's very difficult.
Mm-hmm. And most economists have seen free trade as sort of a watchword and have encouraged free trade areas and different sorts of accords and pacts. Yet in a lot of countries, it's very politically expedient sometimes to sort of go more inward and to have policies that restrict trade and try to protect jobs right there in their own countries, and they go in the other direction. Which direction are we headed? Are we going more toward free trade, or are some countries, Brazil of course has been accused of this, going more inward? Which way is the region really going?
Well, you're absolutely right, and I always talk about my own experience. You know, I'm from Pittsburgh originally, and Pittsburgh, when I grew up, used to be a big steel city, and of course it isn't a big steel city now. Went through a very difficult time in transformation where people lost jobs, industry shut down, but now Pittsburgh is, you know, one of the best places to live in the United States thanks to new industry, medical, environment. And I think the hemisphere right now, because of the slowdown in economic global economic growth, is also in sort of a transitional area, and it's going to have to make some key decisions about how it reacts. Brazil is very concerned about deindustrialization, for example. You know, the percentage of manufacturing in Brazil's GDP has fallen consistently over the last 2 decades. Less than 15% now. And so how are they going to respond? Will they take the critical reforms in tax policy and infrastructure development and labor reform that they'll need to be able to compete long term, or will they, listen to, what some people would have them do, which is to put up more trade barriers? I think Brazil is just one example of countries are going to have to face these issues, and it requires long-term thinking of the kind we've seen from some of the statesmen around and stateswomen around the hemisphere over the last couple of decades that brought us to this point of tremendous progress, and that give us some of these issues that are issues really of success.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And more women in business and in government and politics. Brazil has its first female president. And I wanted to touch on maybe some of the gender issues too. And that's something that we've been talking about during this conference with regard to equality and things of that sort. How do you see that? Have there been many advances that you've seen? Are you happy with regard to where women have gotten with regard to government and business in various countries in Latin America, or is there still a very, very long road ahead? There's
still a road ahead, but obviously progress has been made. And you look at President Rousseff, and she came from a background where you would hardly imagine this woman would become president of the country one day. And it's women, and it's indigenous groups that are participating more, and it's people from all levels of society. Dilma being preceded by President Lula, right? I mean, again, someone who was unlikely to become president of Brazil the time he was born. I think women's progress, in many cases, has been stronger in the private sector than it has been in politics. And we see that in Brazil, where you have, Graça Foster as head of Petrobras, for example, or Magda Chambriand, head of the National Petroleum Agency. In general, though, women's participation in politics at the national level in Latin America still has a long way to go. And I think, in the United States, while we certainly have made progress as well in the number of women in the House and the Senate and at lower levels, participation is still not equal to the participation of women in society.
And what about other sort of minority groups with regard in Brazil, where you are now, or other places around the region? How do you see the participation of minority groups, indigenous groups, also in politics and business. Has that improved, and where are we headed with regard to that, do you think?
Yeah, I think we can say all of this has improved, and I think if we had been having this discussion in 1982, looking back 30 years, these questions wouldn't have even arisen. How are Indigenous groups participating? Well, I mean, there are decisions being made in development on the environment that have to take into consideration, in particular, the interest of Indigenous groups and that territory having been part of their patrimony for a long time in Ecuador and in Peru, certainly in countries with strong Indigenous bases, Afro-Caribbeans, Afro-Brazilians, Afro-descendants in the hemisphere that we never talked about their participation in society before. The growth of civil society in Latin America is, I think, one of the big success stories over the last 30 years.
Okay. Also in the United States, one of the countries that we do read about quite a bit also is Venezuela, as your ambassador to Venezuela. And that has been a difficult relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela in recent years during the Chavez era. How do you see that relationship? And Venezuela has an election. Chavez is ill now. What do you see happening in Venezuela with regard to U.S. relations with that country?
Yeah, well, no crystal ball, right? I mean, the relations have been difficult, but we used to say when I was at the embassy, it's the petroleum stupid, and as long as that relation continues, there will have to be some basis for dialogue between the two countries. For a long time, I think the Venezuelan opposition just wanted to go back to the future and return to the way the country had been operating before Chavez. That was not possible. I think the opposition has learned a lot over the last several years, and you see it going into this election much more united. So I think that's a very favorable development for democracy in Venezuela.
Okay. And just sort of in general to kind of wrap up, we'll never truly wrap up this conversation, but as we're looking over the last 30 years, and we're looking toward the progress that's being made and the progress perhaps in the 30 years ahead, what do you see as the biggest challenges that we really confront in the region, in Latin America and the Caribbean over the next 3 decades? How will those be dealt with, and are you hopeful for the next 30 years?
Well, I'm hopeful. I'm an optimist by nature, but and I think that evidence over the last 30 years gives sound reason for optimism. My concern, though, is that Latin America does a great job of benchmarking against its own past. I'm concerned that it's not benchmarking enough against what's going around in the rest of the world. And so while it knows that certain reforms are going to be required, there's still not a sense of urgency about making some of the changes that Latin America needs to if it's going to be competitive in the rest of this century.
All right, true. What question have I not asked you that you want to answer?
Well, that's a good question. I think maybe the one topic that we haven't been discussing enough in this as we look back at 30 years is exactly the environment and climate change and how much Latin America has to contribute on that issue. You look at parts of the world where water scarcity is going to be a tremendous problem, and there are pockets of Latin America that will confront water scarcity, but in general, this is part of the world that's going to be able to help solve problems of water scarcity or food security. So I think perhaps it's sort of that related set of issues on climate, on environment, the essentiality of Latin America to solving some of the world's problems in this century.